this is a quick introduction to the conversation between myself and Matt about Season 1, Episode 7 of True Detective. And this is the 7th episode of an 8-part series. And actually, we've recorded the 8th part. So I would say of all the episodes we've done, this one strays farthest from the episode itself. So if you're here just to watch a conversation strictly about True Detective, you might be a little disappointed with this one. However, if you're interested in springboarding from some of the ideas and themes from the show into interesting conversations about Carl Jung and the idea of opposites and the psyche that relate to the episode, but again stray quite far afield from the episode itself, then you'll probably enjoy it. We also got into visual communication as opposed to written communication, talked a bit about Terence McKenna, talked a little bit about the hive mind and individuality, human individuality, as well as Saturnalia, because we recorded the conversation on Christmas Eve and because it's mentioned in the episode. And then we talked a bit about the golden bow, and we also talked about the masculine world and the feminine, because again, it's a very common theme in the show. So I hope you enjoy it.
Yeah, your background is a different color.
Is it?
Yeah, it's a little bit more yellow than normal. The top.
Oh, I think it's because I've got the main light on.
Okay.
Usually it's just the background, but
yeah. And it's given a specular reflection off of the left side of your dome.
Oh, right here? You mean this area here?
Yeah.
Yeah, this is exactly where I want it.
Highest point of contrast right there next to the exposed bone and vein.
Hey, I'm sorry about that. I've got always visible veins here, and I've got a V thing here sometimes that bothers people and makes them feel upset.
Reminds them of their childhood.
People also always point out, I mean, if you look at the YouTube comments under the videos that I have, at least 10 will be you look sleepy. What's wrong with your eyes? You have very concave eyes. You have very strange eyeballs. What's wrong with you? Are you deficient in some minerals? Do you need? I mean, it's a lot of comments like that, and I didn't really notice it about myself until about 5 years ago. But now I notice it every day.
It got under your skin.
Speaking of skin, that's exactly what it is. So basically, I mean, if you want to break this down for a second, if you look around my eyes, do you see how that's very like purplish?
Yeah.
I don't know if it's a skin condition or what, but the skin around my eyes has almost very little pigment. So it's translucent skin.
Yeah.
So what you're seeing is like meat, essentially.
Yeah. It's like
just straight fascia and muscle there and veins. I have clear skin.
Yeah, that would be like a Maybelline commercial, but in a bizarro world, right?
Yeah, exactly. Clear. I mean, transparent is what I mean. Sorry, everyone. Hello.
Yeah.
What I mean to say is you can see my bones.
Have you ever seen that old cartoon from Nickelodeon called Inside Out Boy?
No, I don't think I ever saw that.
It's a claymation of this boy, and what happened is he swung too high on the swing set and he went all the way around, and when he came back around and he landed, he was inside out. So his skin and all of his insides were on the outside.
That's gross.
It is. He goes around saving the day. It's kind of gross.
Wait a second. Cool. That's the whole cartoon? That's bold. If you're going to make the protagonist an inside out boy, that's pretty brave, pretty brazen.
Yeah, and one of the slogans in there is that he's got heart, and he kind of puffs up his chest and you see his heart exposed and beating. So
I that's disturbing. There's an episode of Rick and Morty. What's Morty's sister's name? I can't remember, but she gets turned inside out, and it's unpleasant to look at. Yeah, yeah. Just the concept of, being flayed and being inside out. I dissected a cat in high school, and ever since then I've kind of been turned off. I didn't get desensitized. I got more sensitive. I've been turned off by things below the skin. Yeah. Yeah.
You ever seen Hellraiser Part 2 in particular?
No, I've never seen Hellraiser. I think because of that. I think for that reason.
Don't watch the sequel. Don't watch Part 2.
I won't. There's nothing to worry. You got nothing to worry about. I will not watch it. There's no problem. But yeah, I don't know why. I guess it's reasonable to be disturbed. But they say the more you get exposed to it, the more you become desensitized. Doctors have to become desensitized to that, or they aren't able to practice because they would get grossed out all the time. But
imagine the doctor coming in and just going, ooh.
Immediately throwing up in the chest cavity. Sorry, everyone, I'm still not used to it. He's the best doctor in the world.
Yeah.
That would be weird. I'm gonna hit this light over here. Just give me a second.
Yeah.
Camera friendly.
Now we're lit from the same side, aren't we?
Yeah, we will be lit from the same side. Yeah.
My light is on my left-hand side.
Yeah, I have two filters. There's one that's actually called in Final Cut Pro. One is called Matt Podcast. One is called Luke Podcast. And I have to, because the same filter doesn't work for both of us to match us so that we look almost the same. I basically take your video and duplicate it and then crop it so you're layered on top, and then I just color correct them separately.
Yeah, so that Young stuff, it's I was curious, what about, it seemed like something in that quote kind of set you off a little bit.
I get irked by it. I do. I get a little bit upset about it. I don't like, here's the irony. This is the irony. So if I could just tirade for a second. If anyone watching this knows who Jordan Peterson is, they'll know, perhaps, that he was wrapped up in this controversy where he was asked to use certain pronouns for non-binary gender people. He was asked to use certain pronouns, and he refused to do that. And it was in the news and caused all sorts of controversy in Canada. And that's sort of what launched him into the fame that he has now. So the issue then was about inventing language. Basically, call me Zerg, and if you don't, then you're essentially engaging in hate speech. So I'm compelling you to call me something, and you not calling me that is hate speech. Okay, so it's reasonable to be against that. It's reasonable to oppose that, because that's dangerous territory in terms of freedom of speech. But then the same person who is the, I guess, poster boy for non-compelled speech, which to me means that he views language as a thing that exists and moves of its own, I guess, of its own momentum, right? He seems to have that viewpoint. Otherwise, he wouldn't have refused to adopt those pronouns, right? He seems to be an advocate of the idea that language is not something that you can force. In other words, you can't just make up these pronouns and then make them part of culture. It has to happen by itself. There's a process for that, a process of evolution in language. So then when he talks about, say, God, insists on using that word, but what he really means when he says the word God is something else. he has sort of this idea of God as I think he calls it the top of a hierarchy, right? The highest point of a hierarchy is to him God. Now that's a pretty loose definition. If God to you is the line that you will not cross in your personal ethical code, or God to you is whatever that which can be no witcher, or whatever however you want to say that, the ontological God, then that's not the God that most people think of. So you're using God in a different way. Basically, you're saying, I define God as this thing at the top of a hierarchy, even though I know that 90% of humanity would define God, if you were to ask them what is God, as some form of deity, an omniscient, omnipotent deity, immortal, eternal, all-powerful, all-knowing, right? And that's the standard go-to sort of definition that people think of. That's what people think of when they hear the word God. When you hear the word God, I'm pretty sure you have a clear picture in your head of maybe not an image of God, but of a concept that is a being, right? A formed being with characteristics based on your culture. But he seems to not be willing to concede that point. So the problem is that when he uses it as he means it, he's doing the opposite of what he did with the pronoun issue. He's saying, I'm going to hijack this word, even though I know that other people understand it differently, and I'm going to use it to help propagate my worldview or teach people. And the things that he talks about are all very valid things to talk about. I mean, talks about wearing a belt and pulling your pants up or whatever, living in the world, being a man. I don't know. So then that gives permission to everybody who has the other definition of God to then sort of say, this great intellectual, Jordan Peterson, and I are on the same team. And the problem with that is that as soon as you can say Jordan Peterson is on your team and Jordan Peterson says, yeah, maybe, I don't know, then the problem is that those people have a sort of traction now and a sort of, I don't want to say identity.
Galvanization.
Okay, sure, we can say that. Yeah, around their worldview that maybe is undeserved. Right? It's sort of like they've got a foothold that wasn't earned. And I'm sort of about having footholds that are earned. You should earn your footholds. If you're going to have a viewpoint or a belief system, you should have a clear understanding of what your foothold is. And so I just worry that for him, in his almost stubbornness to not acknowledge what people mean when they say God, he's really shooting himself in the foot. That's my beef with it. And I don't know enough about Jung to say that, but that you sent me a quote from a page and it looked like he was doing that with the word truth. So it bothers me because that's not how language works, and it also is an act of shooting oneself in the foot. Anyway, did that make sense?
Yeah. Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah, it's like Peterson is riding this wave of enthusiasm when if people knew what he really thought, they might not be so enthusiastic.
And I know they wouldn't. I know they wouldn't.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and I think even though Peterson talks about Jung a lot, Jung seems to spend a lot of his time parsing that out and making sure that it's clear, that it's understood. He's not trying to maintain the idea of a bearded guy in the sky. I would say, just after reading a lot of his stuff now, that
I've heard people talk of Jung as an apologist, though. He gets painted that way sometimes.
I know the point where I can see that overlap in some of our conversations about Jung is the point where it's the same place where, like you said, that you go to Catholic Mass sometimes for the aesthetic and for the sort of maybe the bigger human experiment side of it, just to sort of absorb I don't know. I mean, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I think Jung is the same way in the sense that he recognizes the historical lineage of the nugget of mystery and wisdom that is sort of way down deep in those liturgies and routines and habits and stuff. And it's more of, I think he more appreciates that. It's much more like a broad, all-encompassing view of history and psychological history than it is thinking, okay, right now, this wafer and this wine is getting turned into the literal body and blood of Jesus. It's not about upholding that. It's more of, when I look at the Mass, or when I look at the Virgin Mary, I also see the concept of wisdom, or Sophia, or of mother goddess cults that go way, way, way back. And so he's not beholden to maintaining the concrete definition, the denotative quality of the Virgin Mary. He's looking at the connotation. So
yeah, and more power to anybody who does that, right? But
I think that's what his work is mostly about.
Right.
So
right, and that's this in the same vein of Joseph Campbell. He's pulling out, he's teasing out the Jungian truth.
Yeah.
from myth, and that's what we should do. I think we should dive into our own culture. We should dive into myth, and we should dive into history and tease out the insights that are buried deep there as a way to help us either think about things in our own lives or move forward or communicate with others. That's an extremely valuable exercise. I mean, imagine if we had the full works of Homer. Homer wrote a bunch of stuff, but we only have a couple things, right? So if we had everything, then we would have those nuggets, those insights. And when if someone reads something by Homer, then you can sort of glean how people thought in the past, right? You can also sort of tease out the universal truths in the myth, right? Yeah. And whenever we do that, we're sort of bringing back up stuff that reinforces maybe what we believe or the norms in the culture that we want to hold on to, right? So it's a valuable enterprise, but I think that it's ingenuine to allow people who read your work or follow you to be under a misapprehension about what you're trying to say. Maybe less so for Jung. I don't want to characterize Jung that way, I guess, but for Peterson, I mean, I think it's better to say, listen, everybody, I'm an atheist. I believe nothing. All right, now let's discuss, and let's see what we can get out. So everybody's clear about that, and then move on. But with Jordan Peterson, people are thinking, well, what does he really think, and does he? It allows people to claim him the same exact thing happened with Einstein. Yeah. People were able to claim Einstein as a theist because Einstein has some quotes about believing in Spinoza's God, which is basically the God which sets things in motion, the clockwork universe God, which is no God, in fact. It's not God. That's a problem. That's a problem, because as soon as you say Spinoza's God, you're not really saying God, because there again, that's not how people define God. Mm-hmm. Sort of a God of the gaps, that ends up just being the very structure of the universe itself, which is ridiculous, because nobody means that or thinks that. That's not the connotation of any god, except for maybe a few people who have gone all the way to the god of the gaps. But yeah, that's my issue with it anyway. I'm frustrated by it. I think people should declare their views so that there's no ambiguity, and then they can dive into whatever they like and try to be as clear as possible with language. Not that everyone can be perfect, but if it's intentional, then I have an issue with it. Yeah. But you're saying Jung is not that way, so good. Is it Young or is it Jung? Because I've always thought it was Jung.
I guess it'd be Young. So.
How did he say his own name?
I think I've heard German people say Young. I don't know. I've only found one video of him actually speaking.
Yeah, I think I've seen the same video.
YouTube.
Yeah. We do want to get into episode 7 of.
Of what?
True Detective.
What's that?
It's a television series on HBO. It's about a little boy and a man named Rust, and they go on adventures together, and they're on the hunt for a dangerous squid.
Here's an interesting connection. Mix these two up. Rust and Marty, Rick and Morty.
Well, that's I've already done that. I've already been through that. I've already mixed those up, and I struggle every single time. I think I've said during our conversations Morty instead of Marty. I have.
That would be a great episode.
Because that would be a great episode. That would be fantastic.
If Dan Harmon? Is he the Rick and Morty guy?
He's the Rick and Morty guy. Have you seen all of Rick and Morty?
I've seen one episode.
Oh my!
I've seen the pilot.
Oh well, you've got to watch the whole thing.
Yeah, and I've seen the clip from the what's the director? The Cronenberg world.
Yes.
Where they go to some world and everything is a Cronenberg creature.
Yes.
That was cool.
Yeah. No, Rick and Morty is full of references, and it actually gets into a lot of pretty cool concepts. They go all in there. They don't really touch time travel that much, but the parallel universes are. They take it to the max. They eventually get to a point where there is this giant space government base called the Citadel, and everybody there is either a Rick or a Morty.
Okay.
everybody there. It's like it's a government. There are thousands of people who work there. There are janitors. There are police officers. Everybody's either a Rick or a Morty, and nobody else. Yeah. And there's one Rick named his name is Simple Rick.
Okay.
And you should watch it. It's a really good series. It's a great series. Yeah.
Yeah.
Probably my second favorite American animation of all time.
And the first?
First, probably Avatar: The Last Airbender. Yeah. Yeah.
I think I've seen one episode of that too.
Yeah, it's good stuff. It's good stuff. I would recommend it. Good world building there. Good universe building. So to anybody watching, if you haven't seen episode 7 of True Detective, that's what we're talking about. Did you have a chance to watch it? You saw it last week, right? When we were going to discuss it last Monday.
And then I watched it again last night.
Oh, you did? Okay.
I did, yeah.
All right, so you're steeped in it. You're probably layers deeper than I am.
Man, I love that show. It's so good.
What from the last 2 viewings have you gleaned from it that maybe isn't apparent on view 1, 2, and 3? I've now seen it twice. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. What is this? 7 and 8 for you? You've seen it many times, I think, right? Yeah.
This will be maybe the 5th watch through in its entirety. I wrote down some stuff to talk about.
Well, let's talk about that first then, instead of in the last 5 minutes.
Okay.
I have some things as well.
Do you just want me to go through the list kind of as I've got it listed?
Doesn't sound very conversational, but we can try it.
Just kick it off. Well, as an overarching thing that sort of came out on this viewing, I wondered how much of a parallel there is between Ulysses trying to make it back to his wife and child in the Odyssey, right? And Rust trying to make it back to his wife and child.
That's what I mean. That's what I mean when I said earlier that, you know, if we had the full works, there would be much more fodder there, because how much can be sort of mapped onto the Odyssey. You know, it's the archetypal hero's journey in every sense.
Yeah, and you should read. Have you read the book Ulysses by James Joyce?
Yeah, I have.
Okay.
I read that in college. Yeah.
I read it this year, and I had Joseph Campbell's sort of companion breakdown of it, and he makes it clear from the get-go, this is a retelling of Homer's Odyssey. And I would go through each book and then read Campbell's explanation of it. And it's amazing just what all goes into a piece of content like that. Just every page full of plays on words, like we were talking about earlier, that a word is a sinewy steamroller that's of incantations.
Mm-hmm.
And so
I think a word is an incantation, because as soon as you say it causes an explosion in the other person's head.
Yeah, and if you're going to spell a word, well, there's the word spell. You've essentially got these, when you see somebody in a movie, I guess a Harry Potter movie, when they're trying to evoke a spirit or some kind of spell, they have to carve sometimes runes into things. When we write down a word, we're carving runes again. So there's these
and you need to say the spell in order to make it happen, at least mentally.
And you have to say it correctly for the right thing to happen.
It's something. Language is a pretty profound invention, and not only is it a time traveling device, you can put something down and speak directly to another person to person, through centuries, long after you've died. How much of you really is that there on that page? Because those were your contemporaneous thoughts being placed there as you thought them. That's as close as you can get. I would argue even closer, if you're a good writer, to having a conversation with someone, because in conversation we have all sorts of, caveats, and we can't find our words, and we have to think about, what other people might think if we say that. So it's an honest way to telepathically link with a person, irregardless of time, the dimension of time. And then, as you said, you're talking about casting spells, and if we're going to get into McKenna at all, he would go off on how when he takes DMT trips, the entire landscape that he ventures to is basically a land of language, and these self-dribbling basketballs are bringing into existence things and showing them to you with great joy. He would go on about that, which, if anybody hasn't listened to Terence McKenna, I would recommend it. But when he gets into DMT stuff, it's really interesting to hear him describe how it's a landscape and a texture based on language. He seems to really focus on that.
Yeah, and another thing, it seems like I've heard Jay Tillman, Father John Misty, mention it, sort of a criticism of writing stuff down, the written word. And Terence McKenna seems to have the criticism of the written word in the sense that it's not phonics based, but character based, as opposed to how we used to communicate in a more image based way.
Right.
And so
sculpture.
Sculpture, cave paintings to get across an idea, even if they can dancing, theater, and all that kind of stuff. So,
you were gonna make a point about. Sorry, you were gonna make a point about the Odyssey. I think I don't want to get off track. I want to go here, but if you want to make a point, then. Because every time we will touch on the tiniest nugget of True Detective, and then we'll just fly off the handle, which is okay.
Well, I think and this might apply to a lot of stories, but if you're going to help yourself understand the Odyssey, help yourself understand True Detective, and help yourself understand other bits of literature, one thing that is fun to take away and interesting to take is that, Rust is essentially, he's on a journey far away from his family, and on that journey he becomes somebody totally different than he was when he left. So when he comes back, he is in some ways unrecognizable. He's totally changed. And so thinking about that dynamic in this story, and then, this is the same dynamic in this other story, this transformation sort of idea. And I think that was really all I got out of,
well, I kind of wanted to get into that a little bit, but in particular how both Russ and Marty seem to be almost moving in opposite directions there. Not that Rust has in any way come full circle, but he, I think, after going through the transformative process and becoming his darkest self, he begins to, as he finds himself near the end, he begins to sort of surface again. And there's in this episode, there's I think an interesting part of his personality that comes up, which is his ability to make conversation and ask questions. That he's never done that before. So on his descent, he has sort of had scrapped all that, and it was never conversational, never asked anybody any questions, was never curious about anybody else unless it pertained to the case. But now, as he reaches the end, as he reaches what he thinks is going to be his upcoming suicide, basically, probably, or whatever he's planning to do after he finishes this last act, if maybe it's the garden, his moment of the garden, maybe that's what he's doing here, sacrificing himself so that he can rejoin his family, the body. Yeah, I don't know. We can maybe get into that too, but he then starts to, I think, play a little bit more rather than have his sort of firm nihilistic tendency. He sort of feels light, that he has almost a relief, a sense of, we're reaching the end. Once we solve this, I'm done with this. I'm done. And so I think he has a feeling of play there. And then Marty has come downhill, completely the opposite direction. He's not on his way down in the same sense, but he has got it all out of his system, maybe his tendencies, the things that destroyed his marriage. He has, he's no longer his normal old self, right? He started his own business. He has left the police force, right? He's sort of scrapped a lot of the things that the mold forced him to be. You know what I mean? If he's the molded character, if he's the stereotypical character, he's got rid of some of those things, even though it's often caused by his own his own actions. But still, he's not married anymore. He's single. He kind of has nothing. He's more like Marty than he's more like Russ than he's ever been, basically, right? Yeah. And sure. And that doesn't make him the same person, but I mean, he's sort of much closer than he ever was. Yeah. And I think the dynamic between them, when there's that scene when he's sitting at home watching TV and drinking a beer by himself, and Rust is out on the dock, also I think drinking a beer. Yeah. They're much closer now. It's sort of like Rust is going this way and Marty's coming down, and they've kind of hit an X right there. Yeah. That's how I saw it anyway. I think that's almost why they did that scene.
Yeah. But that So, that last card I was going to play, this is kind of a decent spot to play it. There's in Alchemy, there's that, I think we talked about it a little bit, but in Alchemy, there's that coincidentia oppositorum, or the marriage of the pair of opposites. And so in the beginning, if you see, Rust is sort of on this end of the spectrum and Marty's on this end of the spectrum, and both of the particularities of their character types are exaggerated, and they seem disparate and sort of distinct. Now there's a bit of overlap and adjoining, so that you've got still their respective characteristics are maintained, but now they're going to operate in concert with one another to affect something bigger than themselves, or to conquer a larger task. And in Alchemy, that's the philosophy underlying Alchemy, is that it's a fully incorporated, activated human being that incorporates their lesser characteristics and their greater characteristics, so that they're a total package, which is what Young was trying to get across in a lot of his writings. So
yeah, incorporating your shadow.
Yeah, so Young has this idea that there's 4 functions. There's the thinking, feeling pair, which are set across from each other, and then there's the sensing and intuitive characteristics, which are set across from each other. So you've got thinking, feeling, and then you've got sensing and intuition, which forms across, right? And so you have a superior function, which is, for example, thinking, which would be Rust, and then you have the inferior function in him would be feeling, because it's set across as its opposite. So he's not a very feely, emotional, warm, driven by emotions kind of character, whereas it's the opposite for Marty. He's all driven by feeling. He's the Dionysian character, and his thinking capacity is inferior. And so, and then the other 2 for them would be what Jung calls auxiliary aspects, or auxiliary functions. They play second fiddle to this main dynamic between these guys of thinking, feeling. But when those 2 guys are together, they sort of.
What would those auxiliary functions be for each of them then?
Oh, they'd be the
alcoholism.
The intuition and the sensing. So, and then even within that, you've got a greater and a lesser in each person. So, and that's where you get this INFTP, or that Myers-Briggs breakdown from. And then in that, you've got a categorization of extrovert and introvert as well. So that's where all that stuff comes from. And funny enough, Jung then ties all that stuff into Alchemy as well. It's super cool.
It keeps coming up recently.
Alchemy, or
yeah, I mean, just in things that I watch, it just seems like it keeps popping up. Alchemy.
Google knows your YouTube habits.
My filter bubbles are converging.
Yeah. So, and so then in this story is, and that's a typical dynamic in a lot of good narrative. Yeah. It's that you see this conflict between a thing and its opposite, and then how do they resolve? Do they incorporate one another? Do they just obliterate one another? Or what? Does one overwhelm the other? And in this case, it seems like a much more alchemical attempt to incorporate.
And it definitely, the way that it plays out happens very organically, but it happens pretty clearly. I mean, that slow process is pretty carefully, I think, structured. If we were to contrast the conversation in the car in episode 1, in which Marty expresses disbelief and almost confusion about Rust's description of reality, which is that we're all walking hand in hand into the void or the abyss or whatever he says. That sets up their polarity. And then now, when they work together, it's sort of like they don't think about it. They don't have any real contentious conversations once they agree to work together on this case. They sort of swim with each other like two dolphins in the same direction. You know what I mean? They really do. And they don't. Marty no longer expresses disbelief at anything Russ says because he's descended so far down that, you know, he has no high horse to be on anymore. Mm-hmm. And Marty has loosened up a bit, and he's become a little bit more sensing in his characteristics, that it gives him the sort of looseness to be able to actually accommodate maybe whatever it is about Marty that before he was a little bit contemptuous of, maybe disdainful of his stupidity or his normalness or whatever it was, his average Joe-ness, right?
Yeah.
And it seems like both of their hard corners have kind of been rounded off, and it allows them to kind of tango a little bit. So when they get married in episode 8, it's kind of perfect, especially on their wedding night.
Yeah, they fly up to New Hampshire or something like that, because in 2012, gay marriage wasn't
right. I think they went to New Hampshire,
Vermont?
And they had the beach wedding, and Maggie was there, and the girls, and it was great.
Yeah. There's a quote from Young, and it says something like, our inability to let something exist in other people is it's like when we give people shit for what we feel are their worst qualities, it's actually us not dealing with that quality.
It's our own
in
prickliness.
Ourselves. Yeah. I'm sure I'll read it again at some point, but
sort of the negative of that creates a spine or a prickle, because we have the same quality in ourselves, and that is by ourselves sort of subconsciously viewed as a deficiency, and so it creates a spine that whenever it encounters the like, it naturally causes us to sort of bristle and critique, or bristle and stay away. And that would make sense.
I had a teacher in 10th grade, and she said the only thing we don't like in other people is the thing we don't like about ourselves. And, you know, that's pretty much a more vernacular, not vernacular, but simpler way to state what Young said. So, yeah.
Don't completely agree with that, but
you don't
I get
completely
it.
agree?
I don't think I completely agree with that. No, I think that's a pretty broad umbrella, a pretty broad stroke.
Sure.
I mean, I think it works for a lot of things, but there's some territory that we could cover here, because just because you brought up, the use of language, and I think that. So we sort of touched on it a little bit a few minutes ago about McKenna's view of language and how language can be an incantation, maybe, in another person, and why language is more than just a way to communicate, right? It's the sort of somehow the framework of human existence in some way. Not specifically writing. Let's just say language. And you mentioned how our ancestors had maybe a more visual or tactile way of getting things across, or a more visual language, which would maybe be cave paintings, and that there's some weaknesses, or there's a deficiency in the written language because we're choosing one word at a time to express something that's not really. It's sort of like trying to squeeze 1,000 gigabytes of information through something that's really meant to only have a few going through it at one time. There's just no bandwidth. The written word doesn't have the bandwidth to express all that's going on in here that we would like to express. And if I were able to sort of link my brain to yours, we wouldn't be able to have this conversation, but it would be very interesting for both of us, probably. And we would probably just immediately say, yep, oh, I agree. All right, see you next week.
Yeah.
And that would be it. So maybe we can start with that. I'm interested in that comment you made about visual language as opposed to the written word. And maybe you can also tie in your profession there.
Yeah, sure. That's a cool challenge. So the visual language, I think, the visual language versus written language, you can almost view it the same way that Jung viewed superior and inferior aspects of personality, like thinking, feeling. If you're all one or all the other, then there's going to be this massive deficiency. You're going to be off center, as Jung's illustration would show. And the need for that feeling aspect to be expressed because you're repressing it, you're not engaging that bit of the stimulus and the information, eventually it wells up and becomes catastrophic in a psychosis or a nervous habit and that kind of thing. So now let's drop that onto.
Sort of just pokes it. It has to poke a hole somewhere if it doesn't find expression.
Right. So let's say
it's got to have a valve and some.
Yeah, and I mean I can relate to this one. So let's say you're a totally thinking person, just totally disengaged from your body. You're all thinking all the time. There's never any literally physical activity, things like that.
Floating brain.
Or engagement with just motor activity and that kind of stuff. Well, that, and in a sense, when you're not dealing with the feelings, everything is always this hierarchy of rationale and rationalities, and not dealing with sort of the emotional push and pull, these things that are more ambiguous and not as mechanical and mathematic. Then when you're not up for that task of dealing with emotions, then when your emotions get triggered, it can be overwhelming, and people kind of break down and they don't know how to deal with emotions because they've spent all their time learning how to think.
Right. So there's no habitual infrastructure to be able to, that when it starts to collapse, it just sort of cascade failures rather than having something to buttress it and keep it up.
Right.
Habits or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, or be like, oh, I've been in this before.
Yeah,
it's not scary.
There's a coping mechanism.
Sure. Yeah. And so, and when we're told not to engage something like our feelings or emotions, then all of that energy that is a feeling energy that doesn't get expressed, it gets repressed, and then it can come back out in a violent way because it has to come out. It has to be expressed. It's a knot that's getting wound up, and it needs to be released. And that when it does happen, when it becomes overwhelming, just that there's no more damming up that ocean of emotion. It generally shows up, and it can show up in a violent way, in a way that the human isn't capable of dealing with, so they just kind of fall to pieces, whatever, regress to a childish, infantile action. And so it seems like, now let's drop that onto written word versus visual communication, pictures, images, and that kind of stuff. So there's the written word it's very good at expressing, let's say, thinking, in that it's much more precise. When you have an image of something, let's say for example, it engages your emotions. When you see a painting or something like that that's beautiful, overwhelming, or it just offers it evokes in you a narrative that moves you, then
but it's highly interpretive, though. It's a highly subjective experience.
Yes, and I think that would be the point of more of the emotional, the feeling characteristic, is that it is more ambiguous, it is more overwhelming, and it's more like a marshmallow, right? Where the thinking is more like a pencil. When you feel the thinking aspect, it's like getting poked by a pencil. It's very precise. You know exactly where it is. You can describe it.
There's less ambiguity about it.
But then with, say, a marshmallow or a warm wind, it's a little bit more big. It's a little bit more amorphous, and maybe you feel it. You definitely feel it.
So with the painting, when you see it, your entire life's experiences sort of make their own interpretations through your eyeballs or your senses and sort of make meaning of it, whatever narrative it might be, and it might evoke different things in different people. And that's the sort of the nature of something visual. You can't force something to happen. It's going to be what it that's in that way. Poetry is more visual than prose, because there's more room, because it's more of a did you say a warm wind? That's a weird phrase, but I like it. A warm wind.
Yeah.
A steady breeze, or whatever you want to call it. I understand the marshmallow concept. And then with prose, or let's just say the written word, beeps, clearly unambiguous, more denotative meaning. You can't misunderstand if somebody says, if somebody writes something, the green tree beside the yellow house, then you'll have your own interpretation of what that might look like, but the reality is maybe a bit more defined in some way.
Or what if you come up to a picture of somebody sticking their finger in a light socket and getting fried, or you come up to a sign that says danger, shock, danger, right?
Yeah.
So it's two different things are getting in. It's like different systems are getting engaged. And so I think in that talk that McKenna gives to the Young Society, that's part of what he's trying to get across, is because we have such an emphasis on this clinical and technical writing and scientific writing at this point, where we've lost the need to that release valve, which is much more like poetic, like you said before, which we might find that more poetic experience in visual art, where you might see an icon, or like an icon like the Virgin Mary or something like that, a painting about Dante's Inferno, stuff like that kind of stuff. So I think, and that's the contrast or dynamic to set up between writing versus visual, written language versus visual language. And McKenna would just want to, I think, incorporate more of the visual, like not totally dismiss it and get rid of it and devalue it, because he's big on visual descriptions because of all of his DMT trips, right? Those are all. But he
describes those as language manifested. He describes those as language coming into reality. In other words, language is the force behind creation. That the beings he meets or met create objects with language somehow. So the visuals come from language. Sort of language gives life, gives the visual characteristic.
Sure. Yeah. Well, and imagine if you had no mouth and you couldn't. If I have a DMT trip and then I explain it to you using words, then you have a picture in your mind built upon my words. But what if I can't speak or write? What if I had to paint that experience, right? To convey that idea with painting. So,
well, I think that's an interesting question, and maybe that's why the Japanese guy who bought those tickets around the moon is mostly bringing painters instead of writers, musicians and painters, because there's something more fruity about visual and maybe sound interpretation of experiences that maybe that 10 gigabytes is not able to fit through the 1 gigabyte bandwidth line. It overloads. I have so much in my head I'd like to share, but it's just that my language centers are not piecing together. Maybe I'm having a bad day, or I haven't had enough salmon, or whatever it is, and I'm not able to piece together syntactically. I'm not able to put together that. So my it's almost like there is an ocean of meaning, and then
Mm-hmm.
a wall, and then this single little pipe that goes from that wall, and the pipe changes from day to day depending on the
Mm-hmm.
condition of my language machine. And that does change from day to day. I'm sure that you've noticed yourself when you're talking about something. Sometimes you're kind of on, and you're able to find the words, and you're able to say it exactly as you want to say it, and you're articulate. And sometimes things are just slow, or the mood changes it. So many things can sort of manipulate that, and so it's sort
Yeah.
of like the only man with the key to the palace full of riches is 83, and he might have forgot where it is, and you don't know how quickly he's going to walk today, and the golf cart is out of batteries. It's too variable, and it's unfortunate. And so communicating visually, and maybe communicating through music, I would say music is more visual than it is textual, is better in some ways, because, for example, if you were to try to paint an experience, a DMT experience, it would probably communicate much more about what that experience was like to me, and be received in the way that you experienced it than if you were to describe it in words. Because if you're going to try to turn it into words, it's almost like putting Greek into Google Translate into English, and then English to Spanish, and finally it comes out in Chinese. It's gone through so many different variations and so many different translations. Now it's lost all of the, maybe it's got the basic ideas across, but it's lost all of what it was to you that made it significant.
Yeah.
Maybe visual. Yeah.
Yeah. And in McKenna's case, rather than only or all the time write about the experience or tell you with words, he would say, just go have it, just go do it.
Right.
Because that, just doing it, it's kind of like, rather than describing to you the Grand Canyon or writing to you about the Grand Canyon or painting it, just go to the Grand Canyon. Because that would be the full experience. That would be, you're there, you're seeing it, you're hearing it, and your body is present in that space.
But there's then a completely other way of looking at that whole dynamic, is if something is visual, you're locked into it. So if you're reading the novel of the movie, and the most modern version of the cover is a picture from the movie, then unfortunately, those actors are going to be stuck in your head as soon as those names pop up in the book, unfortunately, rather than your own creative ability coming up with those characters and creating visuals for you, right? So that, I'm sure that's happened. Maybe that's happened to you before. That sort of thing has happened to me, and it's kind of frustrating when it does, because it's sort of like someone else has made the choice. So there's, I think, a distinction to be made between communication and the power of words to elicit creative thoughts and visuals. So if someone writes something very well, they're sort of sparking your own creative pathways to imagine all those things. But that's not communicating what was in that person's head. In other words, you had the DMT experience. You wrote about it kind of abstractly, and it now creates a very colorful, vibrant world in my imagination that was absolutely nothing like yours. Right? It's totally different. And so in that sense, written language is a sort of like little fireworks that set off imagination explosions for other people. But if we're talking about pure communication, trying to get what's in your head inside my head, and maybe then we're talking about visuals and sound, perhaps, or having the experience, obviously being the best. But I think most people are too scared to do DMT.
Yeah, and it just, when we talk about one form versus the other, we're talking about, okay, what is this form good at? Or what is this form sufficient at? And what is it insufficient at? Right? So if I can describe the music that I heard, or you can actually hear the music, right? Or I can describe the painting to you, or you can see the painting. So the words get you, if I'm trying to it's one thing to try to elicit the same images in your head. Like if I see a painting and then I'm going to try to elicit that same image in your brain using words, that's a very different sufficiency, inefficiency.
Well, words are insufficient for that task. You can never do it, right?
Right. You'd actually have to, and then seeing the painting is the sufficient full culmination realization of the thing that my words are trying to do, right?
Whereas the words would take, you would end up having to describe the coordinates of points in relation to each other and have the other person actually draw it out.
Yeah.
One point slightly to the left and under this one, and then they would have to actually draw that as instructions. Then they would see exactly which is highly inefficient, ridiculously. And
then think if I couldn't use words to describe to you how to bake a cake or to concoct a difficult but effective cancer treatment, right? What if I had to paint or draw that stuff, right? I mean, that's another...
Yeah, you'd have to be good at infographics. This is a tumor.
Yeah. So, and I guess then that stuff with what I'm doing, I think with visuals, there's just a different emotional capacity that gets activated with visuals, and it's strong this way but weak this way. Maybe words are stronger that way and weaker this way. So right. I think, and so I guess maybe with McKenna, he talks about, or with Campbell talks about these primitive tribes that would go down into these caves, and then they would see all these cave paintings when somebody lit a torch and showed everybody what was there. And the visual impact of seeing that, being in the space and having gone through all the tiny tunnels to get down into that cavern with all the cave paintings on it, that's a different experience than just writing it down, reading the book, reading the scroll or whatever, the manuscript. Right. So yeah, it's just different stuff. But what if you could get all that stuff at once? What would that be like? We're trying to, how would we sort of elicit, what kind of experience could we elicit in each other if we could do all those things at once, right?
I wonder if that would even be a good thing. If we could do all of those things at once, then we would become a hive mind. In a sense, it's our differences and our inability to communicate 100%, which allows us to, the sort of jiggling around and misunderstanding allows us to, I think, create new structures. If we were all on the same page 100%, then we might as well just all link up and start building a hexagonal larvae habitats. We would become the Borg essentially, wouldn't we? That our creativity would still be intact, but it would have so many other. If we were able to communicate 100%, if I were able to immediately connect my brain with yours, and not only my perceptions would be yours, but my creative thoughts would be accessible to you. Essentially, it would be like having one brain that has all of the characteristics of two brains, hypothetically, right? So your personality would not then be your personality anymore. It would become a sort of combination of yours and mine, which would then access my memories and my neural structures and the way that I think about things, right? But if that were then expanded to everybody, which it would have to be, then it would have to create these sort of large-scale hive algorithms for, let's say, as a hive, we encounter a problem. Maybe the Earth is being attacked or maybe there's going to be an asteroid or something like that. The way that we deal with that, the solution would come instantaneously rather than it being a small body making the decision, because we would be one brain essentially, but there would have to become an algorithm would have to pop out of the interactions between all of our minds. So I think it's the jiggliness of our misunderstandings that allows us to have interesting individuality, right? And I think we probably take for granted what it means to have interesting individuality. Bees don't have interesting individuality. A bee doesn't seem to have that same sense because their purpose is entirely instinctually driven by the need of the entire hive, and even their shape, their bodies are structured by the sort of quotas that have to be hit depending on the environment. Say this environmental thing happens. All right, so now we need 60 new drones and 20 new worker bees. So these larvae, there are these hormones that are then pumped into the larvae that get squeezed out, that then become those either drones or worker bees that take on those characteristics of drones or worker bees, right? So it becomes sort of a different thing, and I think it's our ability to have a lot going on here, but not be able to get it out, not be able to squeeze it out quickly enough, not be able to get it across to people. It's the frustration and the bouncing off of each other that makes individual expression interesting enough to be able to say, I'm one person and I have my own thoughts. And so, I mean, your question is an interesting one, but I think it leads to the hive thing, which is interesting too, but I think we would not be humanity anymore.
Yeah, so True Detective.
Does that make sense, though?
Yeah, totally. I kind of like the idea of having both, where you have all of the desirable qualities of the hive mind, but you also have the desirable qualities of the individual. So that, I mean, just think of your own body, how this part, this hand is, my body, it's mine. So is this one, but they can act independently, and maybe the right hand is stronger because I'm right-handed and I draw with it and it's more articulate at whatever, like playing computer games or something, where the left hand is a little bit, it's just not as strong. The motor skills aren't as fine. But, and I can adapt to what is needed to serve the whole body, right? So if I need fine motor skills, I use this hand. If I don't, I use this hand, and all that kind of stuff. And it seems like, let's take that analogy and lay it over the globe, so that, okay, to serve this global human body, we need to have this much protein in the food supply. So how do we get that? Well, we can fish this place here, or we can raise this many garbanzo beans over here in this part of the world. So it's sort of like the human body, that global identity has expanded all over the globe to use the whole thing, rather than saying, okay, in North America, we need to raise all of this to serve only North America. So,
right.
But still you'd have the people that are, say, really good at ecology. Well, they're allowed to still be, not allowed, but I don't want to say it that way, but they're still ecologists. They have an aptitude for ecology. They have an interest in ecology. So there'd still be room for that more individual expression and interest. And I think we kind of do it already, kind of like you were talking about the prescription for more, this is I thought I wanted to get out. It's like we need more worker bees like that, right? Here, here, here. Well, it seems like within a lot of policy and governmental decisions in the past, that's sort of been enacted. We would say, well, think about the Catholic Church's prohibition against condoms, right? Or prophylactic use, right? I mean, essentially, that can be viewed, or one way that can be viewed is that's kind of like what you said. We need more Catholics. So how do we do that? Well, we tell people they can't use condoms.
But that's hierarchical, though.
Yeah, isn't there a hierarchy in the bee scheme, the queen?
Well, I'm pretty sure that, well, no, the queen bee isn't doing anything consciously. It's completely. I mean, it's all driven by hormones that are controlled by the environment. It seems pretty autonomous.
I think we'd be the same way.
It's something that I think that we will be surprised how soon we're talking about it in serious. You're saying that I think, but we're talking about something slightly different. So you're talking about when the world is more connected, which is kind of now, right? And we could say, well, we're becoming a little bit less autonomous because we have to sacrifice privacy for the good of a larger whole, right? Being on the internet is a sacrifice of privacy that we all sign off on, even though we're not signing anything. Being on the internet is a sacrifice of privacy for connectivity. So we've already done that to an extent. But what I was talking about was more if brain functions were connected. If we have cybernetic implants that are the internet, then I think that we have to start talking about when does one person stop becoming one person and start becoming a meat bag that's sort of at the whim of the whole, which is essentially the Borg, basically. I don't know. I think there's going to be a line there. I think we're going to get there someday. Yeah. Definitely.
I think we had more of an expression of that kind of function before in more primitive times when people maybe didn't differentiate amongst one another as much as we do now. It seems like right now we have a hyper individualistic conception of ourselves. And even in that talk that McKenna gives at the Young Society, and the talk that McKenna gives in at the Young Society, he goes into that a little bit, and that in the past you did have more of that I am you and you are me, where now we don't. It's like, no, Luke is Luke, and he's all himself. He's all his own thoughts. But then Young might say, and Terence McKenna definitely says that, me and this identity is just this little dot of a consciousness or an ego that floats on the sea of this ancient stuff that everybody has in them, so that if you sort of scraped off the ego part, then everybody would be the same at this way down deep level. And so
is that sense of individuality that we have, maybe we're going way down a track here, but does that sense of individuality that we have derive from cultural norms? Is that because you could say that in Asia there is less of it. Certainly we have it in the extreme now. Everyone has their own Instagram account and their own followers, and we try to create bubbles for ourselves. Is that a cultural illusion?
I'd say, yeah.
Are we already bees in a sense in the hive?
McKenna and Young and other people, and probably Eliade and Campbell and all those guys in that realm, I think that's sort of the case that they're eventually getting at making, especially McKenna for sure, that the individuality idea is a cultural construct. Yeah. The way that it shows up, of course there's a level of individuality where we're separated by space and time, right? So I'm a node over here, you're a node over there, but the fact that to say that we're totally distinct and indistinct, no, we're totally distinct and divided from one another, that tends to negate and deny a lot of truth. Like, we have the same thoughts sometimes. We have some of the same same biology and all that kind of stuff.
So then, but then though, that brings up sort of we have to then sort of differentiate between types of unification, right? So sure. In the Buddhist sense, the dissolution of the ego is the dissolution of a feeling of self-importance, that I must continue, I must persist, and my memories are sacred. Me, this memory machine, this meat bag is important somehow, and that the dissolution of that is somehow an acceptance of being part of a greater whole, and as you said, as on a deep level, way down deep, right? But then that has to be distinguished from consciously parallel to others. So if we have similar thoughts, they're still just similar. In other words, I'm having similar ideas and thoughts throughout the week that maybe you're having, and then when we converge on Monday, we might have some overlap, but they're still just parallel. They're not the same. Mm. But if there was a conscious level, basically plug that goes from me to you, then on that level too it disappears. So there's no longer any individuality of thought. And then there's no point in even speaking to each other. Speech becomes irrelevant. So I think they're just two different levels. There's this sort of acceptance of being unimportant on the Buddhist McKenna Watts level. And then there's the actual technological unification of all conscious thought within the next 100 years or whatever, whenever it's going to happen. That's a different thing.
Yeah. Do you think that is the distinction between those two categories is just a matter of delay, in the sense that
destiny?
Huh.
No, go ahead.
Well, delay in the sense that kind of like with that quote that I sent you, that from the Young book about people's conception of the sun revolving around the planet, right? Earth-centric.
Do you want to read that for anybody watching, just for the sake of? Can you read it? Just because I feel like sometimes we go so deep that anybody watching. I mean, I'm amazed that anybody is watching this, if they are at all.
Yeah. So that quote is.
But we are all one, so maybe they should be.
The quote is, "The psychological rightness of both Eastern and Western yoga ceases only when the unconscious process, which anticipates future modifications of consciousness, has developed so far that it produces shades of meaning which are no longer adequately expressed by or at variance with the traditional symbol. Then and only then can one say that the symbol has lost its rightness. Such a process signifies a gradual shift in man's unconscious view of the world over the centuries and has nothing whatever to do with intellectual criticisms of this view. Religious symbols are phenomena of life, plain facts, and not intellectual opinions. If the church clung for so long to the idea that the sun rotates around the earth and then abandoned this contention in the 19th century, she can always appeal to the psychological truth that for millions of people, the sun did revolve around the earth, and that it was only in the 19th century that any major portion of mankind became sufficiently sure of the intellectual function to grasp the proofs of the earth's planetary nature. Unfortunately, there is no truth unless there are people to understand it."
God damn it.
So basically, it's, he's saying that it took centuries for people's minds to change, because when they debated whether or not the sun revolved around the earth or the earth revolved around the sun, they had all of this backlog of truth that they believed, which told them that the sun revolved around the earth. So over the course of millions upon billions of conversations, slowly people's consciousness was raised to the level where they could accept as truth that the earth revolved around the sun and not the other way around.
Right.
So, and think about just their ability to communicate back then. Like, most people would never even hear that idea. It would just never show up in their life.
There would be onion farmers. The conversation would never come up. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. And so, look at how much time it took for information just to travel from one person to the next.
Right. That's why there's an acceleration now. Yeah.
Compare it to now, when information travels all over the place just instantaneously, right? And so then imagine, like you were saying, when our brains are linked with a cable or
I use that by there better be no cable.
Yeah. Well, maybe to begin with, there might have to be a cable, but then when it's like a Bluetooth connection or whatever, then the experience of reality and the dissemination of how to experience that reality and what the implications of that could be would be instantaneous, right? Compared to, your mind would have everything it needed to be convinced of a specific reality immediately, rather than it taking centuries for that knowledge and information to sink in and change you.
Well, just think about how long it takes for even now a scientific paper's findings, very affirmative findings, to sort of percolate throughout culture. It takes a long time for those things to percolate, even now in the age of rapid information spread, right? So if that stuff is not only accessible immediately, because it is in theory accessible immediately to us right now. You can subscribe to Nature if you want to and read all the findings and decide for yourself if those findings are valid. But if there is a weighting mechanism to decide once something tips the scales of this must be true, to immediately sort of disseminate that to the entire planet, not on a word by word level, but on a deep sort of level of somehow a perception, as though we smell flowers, we see trees, and we know new information that has been discovered. It's sort of just there in our implant. That's definitely on the horizon. It's here now. It's already here, but it's just that we're too lazy to subscribe to Nature, and we don't. And those papers are heady. Those papers are not fun to read. I'm subscribed to Nature. I don't read those papers. It's just boring. It's just boring to just check it all the time and read through the whole thing. So you want to just check the summary really quickly. But there will be ways to know when something is known, and that will immediately spread. The question is, what is the depth of that global neural connection that we have? Does a bee experience a feeling of, I am me, I am a bee, I must do my duty to my whole colony and sacrifice myself when I need to, but I am a bee and I am me? Or is it sort of just like a sort of, do we become automaton and serving only the whole? Do we become the cells of the body, essentially, that can be expended? And I know we can be expended, and you could say that soldiers in the past were sort of the cells of the body of a country, of a nation, but...
Or the analyst at Apple that does this one tiny minute bit of minutia for Apple Maps or whatever.
Right, exactly.
You're fired. Let's get a new guy.
But that dude has a girlfriend, and he likes playing Red Dead 2, and he likes to drink Nespresso, in the evening, and watch Twitch. So he's still a person, even though he has a minute role to play. I'm very interested in that future, because we're heading there. Sure. What's it going to be like? Yeah.
I wonder if we were. It would be amazing if we could know now, if we had somebody who had lived both lives, one as an individual, one as a drone, which one they would want to live again, right? Because to kind of, we don't know how to experience what a drone feels. Maybe it wouldn't, let's imagine, maybe it wouldn't want the individuality. It's like, no, that sucks. That's awful. I'd rather just do this, because this experience of being a drone and all the things that I do are so satisfying and meaningful that to be an individual sounds awful. Or maybe it's like, I hate being a drone. I wish I were an individual. It could just set sail and fly off and,
Man, this has already been explored to some extent in Star Trek, but the Borg.
Okay. Yeah.
There's nothing to laugh at, man.
It's cool that's the...
Have you ever watched Star Trek, the Next Generation? I
used to watch it. I've seen it, quite a few episodes when I was a kid.
Well, the Borg stuff gets into this question, because there are Borg. They're part of this bee-like hive, travel through space and assimilate cultures and civilizations into themselves. And sometimes they get unplugged, and they have to go through the process of becoming an individual, and it's completely alien and foreign to them, and they sometimes can't deal with it and die because of it. So it's a really good question, and I think we'll be asking ourselves questions like this on a more practical basis pretty soon.
Yeah.
Pretty soon. I'll wait for others to do it first, though. You first. I'll be there in 10 minutes.
we'll let what's his face be the guinea pig. Who's the Tesla guy? What's his name?
Elon Musk.
Elon Musk. He's got that neural net thing he's talking about.
So, I wouldn't want him to be the first in the hive, though. I mean, he's of anyone, he needs to be on the outside of the hive, making other people go into the hive.
Okay.
Yeah. Tell me what to do, Elon. I will do anything you say.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was going to bring up a couple things because one, it's the day before
from the show.
Yeah, from the show. True Detective, season 1, episode 7.
True Detective.
Yeah. Drew Barrymore plays Rust's grandma, but she's underground the whole time. You never see her. Saturnalia.
Yeah.
Yeah. That was mentioned.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought it up because that's one of the things I wanted to talk about.
Saturnalia is, 2 days ago? Something like that?
Was it?
Yeah, I think so. It's a December.
Okay.
It's a December holiday festival. Celebration.
Winter festival, I think is what they call it in the show.
Yes. You want to talk about that? Why'd you want to bring it up?
Yeah, because
I wanted to talk about Saturnalia, and I want to talk about tentacle monsters.
Go. You start. Why did you? What about Saturnalia? Did you want to mention?
Well, I think that it's interesting that we actually wanted to once again diverge from the show and use the show as a springboard. Just the mention of Saturnalia and then sort of springboard from there has really nothing to do with the show itself. But the fact that it is, imagine being someone back then who celebrated Saturnalia, looking into the future and seeing us celebrate Christmas. They'd say, "You guys are celebrating Jesus? What? No, you're not. You're celebrating Saturnalia." You know, it would be a kind of silly thing for them because we're kind of celebrating the solstice. Winter solstice.
Equinox is the one before this.
Thank you. Yes, solstice. We're kind of celebrating the solstice. We're celebrating a pagan holiday. We're not celebrating anything about Jesus. We're just we use that as sort of the garb on top of something that's much deeper, that's been there for thousands and thousands of years. And there was probably something that preceded Saturnalia. And Santa Claus is also, there's an interesting Terence McKenna talk about Santa Claus and how
so many things.
The juniper tree and the why red, why white, why Santa Claus flies. So I think there's a lot to explore here. Once again, departing from, I think it's okay if we depart from the show because
this goes.
It's sort of like an evolution of, I don't know. I think it would be artificial to try to adhere very strictly to only a discussion of the show.
I think the way we could take this conversation would actually just make the show seem more rich and dense. Because if you think about it, the show is just an expression of all these ancient things we're talking about anyway. So what are those ancient things? And then when we come to something like a show like this, then we can almost sense and feel it on a bigger, more grand level. I think that's what I get when I watch this show.
Right.
For instance, the I think they call it the Winter Festival. It's called Saturnalia or whatever.
Celebration of Saturn in ancient Greece, Rome.
Yeah, lay it out. I mean, Phil.
Well, Saturnalia is a celebration of the gods of Saturn.
Yeah, so I think Saturn would be Greek, and then Kronos would be the Roman equivalent.
Yes, yeah. But I don't think they celebrated Kronos, did they? So the Romans probably celebrated Saturnalia because the Romans, they masturbated to Greek porn, basically. They did.
You don't?
Right?
They had a lot of weird,
they revered
centric stuff.
No, they revered the Greeks. The Romans almost had a sense of inferiority about the Greeks. They took a lot of the Greeks as slaves, but the slaves of the Greeks were often the most renowned teachers in Roman society, and they aspired to write plays on the level of the classic Greek plays. The Roman playwrights knew that they weren't even close, but they aspired to get there. They revered Greek society. They revered Greek culture, and at a deep level, they were what is it? Hellenophobes.
Huh.
Just sort of like how in the South there was a period of time in the South where there was a sort of a Francophile era where they were kind of obsessed with French culture, and they thought that that was the highest class of culture. That was what Greece was to Rome. So I'm not sure, but I think that the Romans celebrated Saturnalia as the original Greek god, because they basically, took the Greek gods and Romified them. But I think Saturnalia might have stayed the same. I don't know. I need to do some reading on that, but I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, if you want to drop in details of what happened in the Saturnalia, go for it. I think what their mention of the winter festival triggered when I heard him say it this time was, oh, that's like, and then they've got the the female bound and crowned on that scaffolding, and then there's all the masked men around them. That goes into in James Frazier's The Golden Bow, which is a foundational work for modern anthropology, not because he was necessarily accurate about everything, but his method and his all-encompassing attempt was the first of its kind. So James Frazier I think he was just an accountant in the Northeast in the early 1900s that just wanted to figure out, why does the priest at Nemi, he wanted to figure out some detail about a Greek rite, which is the priest at Nemi, in his relation to the Golden Bow. Do you know that story?
No.
It's kind of like the Highlander. There can be only one. You've got this priest who is ever vigilant, always awake, and he's the priest of a sacred grove. Okay. And what's happening, and so what's happening is all these other people want to be the priest at Nemi. They all want that same position to do what he does. And so the only way to get that position is to kill the current priest. Okay. So the only way to get the opportunity to kill the priest is you have to get the golden bow, and then you have the right to challenge the priest. And if you can kill the priest, then you become
How do you get the
priest.
golden bow? Do you find it?
Yeah, you have to go get it off of a tree. You have to cross the river. You have to climb up and get it. There's some, I think, perilous journey to get that, and then you have the right to go challenge the priest.
Why does everybody want to be the priest?
I think Fraser. So, well, I think you sort of become the consort of the goddess if you become the priest, and because you became sort of the guardian of this sacred grove of trees, and that was, I think, a representation of the goddesses, sort of that kind of dynamic. And so James Frazier wanted to figure out that story.
So it was his gateway drug.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, that's awesome when that happens, when you have a question that you can't answer, and then you realize that you've just wandered into a place that is never going to let you escape.
Call to adventure, right?
You are different now, sir.
And so what happened with this guy is he was this accountant. I think he was an accountant. He did something with the financier or something, and this one question kept nagging him. And then when he just started to research it, it just led into all these different avenues of anthropological data. All right. And so he ended up composing this series of 12 volumes of books, something like 10,000, 12,000, 14,000 pages, which he called the Golden Bow. And it was this survey of all of these different tribes and practices all over the world. And that work became one of the foundational pieces for anthropology ever since. Campbell mentions the guy. I read the book. There's an abridged version, which is something like 800 or 900 pages, and I read that, and it's insane. It's super cool. In that book is where you can find these examples of these accounts of tribes that would sacrifice young people. A lot of times, there's one in particular, I forgot where it was. It may have been in Borneo or India. I can't remember specifically, but what they do every year is they dress up this little girl in, they put a sheaf of corn on her head, and they take her around to the different places in the village, and she does a dance and she gets a gift or something like that. And this is, the time period is, I can't remember how many hundreds of years ago, if not, I don't know, maybe thousands of years ago. So she's getting led around the village, she's dancing, and in the village, they construct this scaffold and put all of this different vegetation around it. And at the end of her dance and procession around the village, she goes up to the top of it. She does a thing. The priest says an invocation or something. Then she descends. I think there's a party. And then she comes back up. And eventually, they kill this little girl. They cut her throat. They do something. And she expires. And then it gets really sick. The priest then cuts off her skin and then wears it around the village. Okay? So it's a really horrific rite. But the idea is that, and so in the show, that winter festival is an echo of that, right? So, and then you can see the murderer in the show. He's doing the same thing. Kind of like you were talking about Christmas, we celebrate Jesus and all that. Well, it's a much more watered down, much more mundane, less violent version of sort of the sacrificing of this girl. Because what that did, the reason why they sacrificed the girl is they thought that when they sacrificed her blood would go back into the ground to revivify the ground, so that next year there would be the continuation of a bountiful harvest. So they didn't really see it as this horrific act. It wasn't like that. And Eliade, a lot of these anthropologists make that same claim, that when they did these things, it wasn't as murderous and horrific as we view it today. There was a different sentiment attached to it, much more like it was matter of fact. And so
had to be done.
And then, yeah, it's just, this is how things work. Yeah, of course we do that. This is how we understand these things to work. And then Fraser gives all these accounts of how in the beginning it was, I think, an animal sacrifice, then that morphed and transformed into a human sacrifice, and then that morphed and transformed back into animal sacrifice, and then it turned into just vegetables. We'll just burn vegetables, or we'll throw a bunch of vegetables on the altar, and then it became, nothing. We don't do anything today. So,
well, think about the stakes, though, to someone who lives in the, back to the Jung's point about, it doesn't matter what's true in the sense of true, in the word true, it matters what the pervading belief is, right? And I mean, this girl, let's say she wasn't even afraid to do what she was doing because of the strength of the belief that she had and the entire village had, probably, right?
Yeah.
There was no doubt. There was no question. Doesn't matter what's actually going on. It's the perceived truth. Maybe that would be a better word for that quote that you shared. Perceived truth of the village. And so, when the stakes are perceived to be that high, when the stakes are perceived to be, if we don't do this act of propitiation, the corn will not come. Right. We will all die. Yeah. If we do not sacrifice the goat, it will not rain. Imagine what that would be like. That's like us, what if we found out that every year, and this is the reality as far as we know it, the reality is that every year, if we don't visit Facebook once a year, then the entire internet will collapse and be destroyed forever, right? You have to sign into your Facebook at least once a year, or else the entire internet will collapse. You do it, December 30th, right at the end of the year, you might sign in. I mean, you'd probably do it more than that, but if you had to do it, you'd do it. Because that would keep it open. Now, it doesn't matter if it's true or not, because the stakes are so high, that single act becomes a no-brainer. Essentially, it becomes a sort of well, you'd be insane not to do this. And it seems to us to be kind of a ridiculous, cruel, insane, bloodthirsty, act, animal act almost. Mm-hmm. But that's looking at it through centuries and centuries of knowledge gleaned from discoveries, throughout history. So I think that we should then keep that in mind now to wonder, what things do we feel that we need to do now that are actually on some sort of ontological level ridiculous? Yeah. What is it? Is it marriage? What is it? What do we do now? And that kind of goes back to I think a couple of weeks ago we had that conversation about the shifting tapestry of the moving zeitgeist. But I think that just appreciating that is, if you can't appreciate that, then you can't really understand history, and you can't really appreciate that you're probably just as gullible, but lucky to be born in a time with a little bit more knowledge about the world. Yeah.
And it can also inform the way we think about where we're going, what we wake up and value tomorrow, what we decide to do with what we think about. It's like, maybe there's some psychological hang up, or, thinking about, I do this, like I'll think about this rotten person that really grinds my gears in my life. And then I wake up and think, maybe I do that all day. Then I'll wake up the next day and think, well, that doesn't really do anything for me. So why am I going to carry that habit that does nothing for me into the future?
Right.
When actually the way things work is, if I think about this other thing, my life goes in a direction that I want it to. Right. So.
But then there's sort of a conflict there. There's the I guess, Eliade celebration of the eternal ritual, the thing that allows you to stay in touch with your eternal self, which would seem to sort of reinforce the idea of, yes, carry forward your traditions, learn from what your parents taught you, and teach your children the same thing so that they can do the same, because this knowledge, you're standing on the shoulders of giants. This is ancient knowledge. And well, maybe standing on the shoulders of giants is a bad analogy, because that sort of suggests that there's improvement with each generation. You must carry forward tradition in order to survive. But what you're saying is we learn from the knowledge that there are some things that are kind of redundant that we could probably do well by cutting out, and then that would help us move forward. So it's sort of like the opposite viewpoint. What lenses can we put on now that help us sort of shed our I guess snakeskin that's holding us back, that we can use to move forward?
Yeah, it's more of the idea of keeping what's effective and shedding what's ineffective. So we think, to have a bountiful harvest, we don't need to sacrifice the little girl just so she gets, her blood spills onto the vegetation, and then she's a representative of the earth goddess, and so then she embodies, and then the priest wears her skin as though she's been resurrected to be as powerful as she was before, only in a new body, and then go back out. It's like, no, that's not what it is. You just water the grass, right?
Yeah.
So you just put the seeds in there, you put some fertilizer on it, and you water it occasionally, and that's actually what brings about the good harvest. So we don't have to go through the whole. So it's almost like our consciousness of what is effective becomes more acute, but it's still built off of that idea of that cycle, right?
But it's the trappings. It's the trappings of those things that allowed those innovations to carry forward. So in other words, the story that included the nugget of truth that allowed the next harvest was necessary in order for it to stick to the memory and bones of the people who were carrying them out. In other words, if you just said to everybody, all right, don't forget to water the peas this year, all right?
Sure.
So people wouldn't carry it forward because there's no ritual in that. There's no story in that. It doesn't stick to your bones in the same way that, God, it's sort of like, have you ever done something and then there's a disproportionate reward for that? In other words, you did something and disproportionately you got something.
Tumblr post.
All right, so you posted something on Tumblr and it got, 100,000 shares or something, whatever it is. You feel like, and then there's this weird feeling that happens that's sort of like, I didn't deserve this. I'm unworthy, and I feel a little bit almost.
Schadenfreude?
No, Schadenfreude is the wrong word. Schadenfreude means you enjoy when other people suffer, right? That's Schadenfreude.
Okay, then that's no, that's not what I meant.
That's the Schadenfreude. This is a feeling of insecurity and that I don't deserve what I got, huh?
An unearned foothold.
Okay, we could say that. Sure.
Because you said it earlier.
Yeah, let's say that an unearned foothold that I've received, and it's sort of like if we did just what is necessary, which is just water the peas and use a little Miracle Grow. It almost feels like a Pareto principle, sort of 80-20. That would be the best possible thing, but we don't deserve it. We must sacrifice something or else we're unworthy. I think there's something there in human nature that makes us feel like we don't deserve good things. We don't deserve the reward. And sometimes things are a lot easier. For example, watering the pumpkins instead of killing a goat, and also watering the pumpkins, and the ritual of killing the goat includes watering the pumpkins, right?
Yeah.
So I wonder now, have we completely thrown off that? Is it shackles of the skin, the film of the story, and now we live entirely in the rational, in the true, and what is actually true? Maybe that's the issue that I have with the Jungian word true there, is that true means true. True means it is true. True means the water is the thing that makes the peas grow. That's true. That's what I mean by true. So don't use it in any other way. In other words, is that a negative direction, that we've gone so far to the other end, the pendulum has swung so that we're missing out on the story? Or are we moving in the right direction and we should continue that swing and live in the rational, because that allows us to be more efficient and discover new things and, eventually become higher dimensional beings or whatever?
Yeah, it seems like Jung would then say that when we become totally rational, totally thinking, totally empirical, that our biology still has this feeling capacity, which is irrational. The unconscious is irrational. That's sort of one of his big tenets, especially in the section I'm reading right now about alchemy and psychology. And it makes connections where there shouldn't be or are no connections. But for a reason. It's to illuminate something, to show something. There is the connection is legitimate, but from our perception from the outside, it can seem irrational.
Right.
And so it seems like one of the things that he's talking about is these psychoses show up when we become completely one or the other, when we become completely thinking, empirical, data-driven, to the level of exclusion of the irrational, which is the creative aspect. And so, because our biology includes that irrational drive, the drive, that the need to have the irrational. Like, we're not beyond that yet. Maybe we would be someday, maybe not.
He's just sort of saying it as it is. We have baggage.
I don't know if baggage seems to have kind of a negative connotation. I don't think he really paints the unconscious.
That would be a Sagan-esque maybe way of saying it.
Baggage.
He's just saying it as it is. He's not. He's neutral, maybe more neutral. Baggage
Absolutely,
baggage would be a word used by a very forward-looking person trying to sort of help humanity transcend its human sacrifice age. You know, maybe Jung is more focused on what are we? What kind of creatures are we? What is the reality?
Definitely. Yeah. He's more interested in the Dharma, the Tao, the Ma'at, the me, all of those ideas of what is, what is the human being, and understanding that before trying to make a decision to move this direction or that direction. Mm-hmm. In fact, in his psychological process, in his psychoanalytic process, when he is laying out what he does, he says, no, let's understand what is first. Before we get to dealing with your complexes, let's understand the way you think, the way that you work now, and then we will decide which way we want to go. Where maybe somebody like Sagan, he already has a clear picture of which way we should go. Mm-hmm. Do you think?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, that might be a helpful way to lay it out.
Just looking at it from two different sides, I think maybe one is focused on the roots and the other is focused on the vision forward.
Yeah. And so to wrap that back into the show, the Winter Festival and the Saturnalia and that kind of thing, the question I asked myself after I saw that was, does the ordered spiritual hierarchy, what was it? Hang on, sorry. So you can look at, so you've got this, essentially this cabal of these sort of a priest class that's hidden, right? They still maintain this sort of occult ritual, right? You've got these rich, wealthy, powerful men that go out into the woods to repeat this festival over and over again, where they actually do awful things to kids. They kill women, whatever, right? That's what's going on in the show. And so it's almost like that, you've got these people that are maintaining the old method of the ritual. And for what? It seems, I don't know. Maybe it's because...
Well, the question I then asked myself, the same question that I asked myself also, because it's not explored deeply enough. Is it that they're engaging in a ritual that is so taboo that they have to sort of engage this very large conspiracy in order to keep it under wraps? Or is it that they're just a bunch of sexual deviants who are trying to, have an excuse to do horrible things to children? Which is it? And that question is not answered clearly until maybe the next episode. I suspect that there's a little bit of both going on. Maybe Ledoux and the tentacle face, it goes both ways for them. That one doesn't exist without the other, maybe.
But it seems to point to the running theme that we've talked about in the show, is that you've got this sort of crusty spiritual this crusty hierarchy that's still in place and still operating according to the old traditions, when really those traditions aren't necessary, and in fact they're corrosive to the people that have to live within that condition, right?
Right.
So you've got this hierarchy of powerful people, a priest class, a king class, a royal class, that insists on maintaining this order of society, right? You've got the church that it maintains. You've got the idea of how the idea of masculinity and femininity are maintained and propagated forever and ever, even to the detriment of the current consciousness, right? Consciousness is getting beyond the need to, or beyond the stage where it had that Mad Men-esque view of male-female dynamics.
Yeah.
But there's even in 2000 or 1980s, 90s, 2000s, you've still got this elite group that wants to maintain that sort of psychological stranglehold, to maintain that order, which keeps them in the positions that they have. And it won't allow for that chaotic, encroaching feminine principle to overcome it, wash it away, and then allow something new to come out, something more appropriate for the current times.
I mean, imagine like calcified structure like a stalactite or a stalagmite in a cave, poking up from the cave floor with water flowing through it. It's going to remain longer than maybe you would hope it would, right? And it maybe the limestone will erode inevitably. It's going to go away because you can see the water flowing. The feminine will eventually basically make these things disappear. The feminine side, things will balance out. Maybe the pendulum will swing too far. Maybe we'll have a matriarchy or whatever. But there's so much power in these old traditions that are so calcified that we're sort of watching a snapshot of this. We can see what the cultural milieu is, right? We can see what's going on. But against that, there are these ancient structures that are very hard to wash away because they're made of stone, because they're not flexible. And it's their traditional nature which keeps them in that inflexible sort of state. They are there because they're built to be inflexible. It's sort of like the Catholic Church. It's designed that way. It's sort of like like the shell of an animal, right? If you have that for a reason, it protects you against attack. It protects you against change. So
and it's reliable.
Yeah. And so that's something that we haven't really gone deeply into. We've gone deeply into the masculine, feminine, but I don't think we've gone deeply into the I guess orthodox side of it. We went into it a little bit in the last discussion, the church side of it, the calcification of the church. We talked about the calcification of the church, the Catholic Church, and the preacher at the revival who quit and why he quit. We talked about that a little bit, but I think that there is a sort of a war going on between the feminine and the ancient masculine hierarchy, tradition, archetypes, maybe. Yeah.
So one thing I did want to toss in there that I'd like to carry forward when we talk about it is this idea of, you see these, it's sort of hinted at that it's people in power that are perpetrating these acts, these horrific things. And what does that mean? Well, it means they're sort of untouchable and unaccountable to everybody that they're affecting, right? And so, you go when in the scene where Rust goes into the office of the preacher. I mean, that guy, he's at the top of his game. He's at the top of the hierarchy. He's, at the top of the pyramid. Nobody, he's accountable.
He sees when he visits Tuttle.
Tuttle, yeah. And same thing, the governor, that's he's untouchable, or kind of like in this episode, the guy who became sheriff. In a sense, he's one of the untouchable ones. He's no longer, if he were the janitor at the police station, he'd be accountable to every single person that works there. But as the sheriff, he's accountable to nobody except the few people that are above him, right?
That's why they gave him a Maserati.
Yeah. And so carry that. And so what that happens is when those people that have ascended that position become untouchable and unaccountable, then they get to pretty much dictate that same crusty idea stays the same, because there's nobody to challenge it. There's nobody to say, hey, you can't do that. You have to be accountable to the people that you're affecting. That just the higher you rise up in that power hierarchy, the further you are away from your accountability.
Even if the days are numbered, it can let's enjoy it while we can. You know, that's why I thought it was interesting that sheriff had a Maserati, because he had busted somebody and kept the car. You remember that?
Yeah.
He drives that Maserati. That's interesting because he's one of those people in that hierarchy, and the system gives him the ability to keep that, to have that symbol of power that is undeserved, but because he exists at a certain place in the hierarchy, he gets to have it without questions as to, why do you get to have that? You shouldn't have. Yeah. You're a sheriff. Why do you have that car?
Yeah, look at the chaos. Even though the system provided you with this comfort and this luxury, look at the resulting chaos that crusty structure doles out to everybody else, right? So, and at the same time, one thing that's interesting is that, you know, you wouldn't have, unless you have people that are insulated from being accountable to some degree, then you're not going to have the same type of creativity. Say, for example, somebody who is a brilliant coder who doesn't have to cook for themselves, doesn't have to do all these other things, so they can use all their time for going off and coding, right? They don't have to have a day job where they're a janitor at a school or at, you know, a shopping mall or something. They have all this time to go do this one specific thing they're good at, and then they can rise up in that hierarchy and get better and better. So there's a level of having that where that insulation can be something that we desire, but then that same type of insulation can become parasitic and corrosive, right? So think about a musician, right? Being able to go off and be by themselves and not have to worry about paying bills all the time, so that they can think and work through different esoteric ideas and then hopefully come back with something beautiful that everybody loves. But there's that level of insulation where they're not accountable to anybody, that does allow them to explore things that most people don't have the time to explore. So anyway, the positive and negatives are interesting to think about
yourself there.
Yeah, sure. Why not?
Yeah. And then Rust, in this battle between the crusty old hierarchy and the corrosive force, is sort of this catalyst. He's sort of the catalyst agent. He's the thing that speeds up the process. He has his own motivations. He's internally motivated because of what happened to him. But it's going to happen. It's inevitable. He is going to catalyze if that's an alchemical process, he's going to be the one to catalyze that. Yeah.
You know, and I think McKenna talks about it in that talk to the Young Society, is that the catalyst is what accelerates that process, yet it remains intact through it. Doesn't change.
Right.
So let's say water is the catalyst. Well, when you put it into the thing you're trying to catalyze, well, the water isn't going to be consumed, destroyed, or whatever by the process.
Water,
it's still going to stay water.
So rust stays rust.
Maybe. I don't know. You got one more episode, right?
Ooh. Yeah. Yeah. Interesting. Yeah, we haven't really talked about it on that level before, so I'm glad we did. Glad we got into that. I was going to bring up the tentacle monster.
Sure.
We've got two tentacle monsters now. You've got Ledoux, who was wearing the gas mask when he first came out of his meth lab. And then you've got the tentacle monster with the green ears,
green ears spaghetti monster.
Spaghetti monster, yeah. Who is scarred and kind of looks like that. He probably should have had more scars. It's not as obvious as it could be, but though both of those people on the same side seem to have a similar characteristic, and I wonder if they're trying to set up are they just trying to make that? Are they just trying to make a man into a creature? Or are they trying to sort of Cthulhuize the person so that they're more villainous, or is there some other symbology going on there?
I'd guess the second of what you just said is to make these guys into a mythology, to mythologize their characters. So one, to make them more scary, and then number two, to sort of subtly announce, hey, this is a metaphor, so that you and I can have this conversation we're having about, okay, well, how does this metaphor show up in real life? What are we seeing around us right now that this television show can actually reveal to us, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I just wondered if there's any other symbolism that you picked out from that. That's
no. Yeah.
He gets interesting in the next episode.
Spaghetti Monster
gets interesting. I wonder why he changes his voice. I wonder why he is so approachable.
Yeah.
So intelligent. He seems extremely intelligent.
I can't. Yeah, I'm looking forward to that conversation with you. That's going to be interesting to see just how the show resolves, how the characters everybody is on full display, their capacities and their inefficiencies, and it's everything all at once.
Yeah. So to anybody watching, so for the next one, it's going to be the last episode of the series, and the next season is completely different characters. So this is it. It's a self-contained story about these characters. And if this is the first one you're watching, then go back and watch 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, and then we'll have 8 up. And I wonder what's going to happen. I mean, I've seen it, but there's a lot to explore in the last 30 minutes of the last episode. There's a lot going on there.
Yeah.
So that should be interesting. We might actually get back into the show itself instead of just going off on a bunch of tangents, which is fine. Yeah, man.
I did notice a couple of things. The hermaphrodite illusion at the beginning of this episode, where Rust goes to visit Johnny Joni.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a big metaphor, a big mythological metaphor. There's a story, I don't know if this has anything to do with the show, but it's the one, Hermes Trismegistus is supposed to be a hermaphrodite, and it's sort of the bearer of wisdom, of knowledge.
Yep, we've talked about that.
Provides, so there, that could be a potential
Didn't think about
illusion.
That's interesting.
Yeah, and his character is built upon his ability to see or not to see, right? He's like, it all has to be a dream, or I had my eyes closed, my eyes were open, I could see under my eyelids. He keeps saying stuff like that.
Yeah.
And I think in the story of Tiresias, he was a Greek character that walked up on these two snakes copulating, and he separated them with his staff. And for that, he was turned into a woman. And so he lived as a female for a certain amount of time. Then he came back upon these two snakes copulating again sometime later in his life, and he separated them again, and then he was turned back into a man. And then Zeus and I think Hera were having a discussion about who has the greater pleasure in sex. And they were like, well, let's just ask Tiresias. He's been both. And so they bring him up and they ask him, and Tiresias says, well, it's the woman who has the greater pleasure in sex. And so Hera doesn't like that answer. And so I think she blinds him, but then gives him the gift of vision. So of seeing the future or something like that. And Campbell goes into it. He dissects that myth in a pretty cool way. Like, why did she get pissed off?
Why does she? What does he say?
I think he says that because of I forgot why. I couldn't articulate it right now. It's interesting, but I wouldn't be able to articulate it and repeat it. It's something about winning an argument, or who gets validated when he gives that answer. Something.
It's interesting that you mentioned that, not because I have a profound point there, but have you seen Blue Planet?
No.
So there's the second season of Blue Planet. It's just a David Attenborough documentary series, sort of like Planet Earth, but focused on sea creatures. And there's a fish called the kobudai fish, and it goes through that transformation. So it kind of goes back to what you were just saying there, and also goes back to the quotas of the bees. So if there is a male and maybe he's getting old, it's sort of a male has a harem and controls a territory like a horse does. There's a lead male, and then the mare in a hierarchy. Horses have a hierarchy, right? So there's this fish, and they have a territory. And if one fish starts to get old and needs a challenger, but there are no challengers around, or if maybe there's a new space that opens up, there's sort of a niche that opens up, then this fish, this fish, I think it's called the kobudai fish, it has this giant, the males have this giant bulbous head, and this giant bulbous sort of, looks like it's gas-filled gullet sort of thing, and the females are much smaller, as most females are. Basically, when that niche opens up in whatever capacity, one of the larger females will go into a dormant state and undergo hormonal transformation and become a male physically. They'll grow this giant sort of crown thing and gullet. They'll start producing semen or sperm. They'll become temperamentally like a male. They will become males. And then they will, come out and challenge the old male who needs to be replaced. So that for the sake of the balance of the ecosystem, if you have an old male in a community or in an ecosystem, the ecosystem suffers. Just like that old giraffe who was killing the young giraffes, so they had to take that giraffe out. They had to kill that giraffe because you want the bulls to come up, because that large giraffe who was killing the young giraffes, he couldn't mate anymore. So he needs to be taken out. So the ecosystem somehow it knows that has to happen, and so a female will just sort of sink down into this shipwreck and become a male, fight this old male, and make it move to another territory, or maybe it will just become the sort of alpha male in this new territory, whatever it is. But it's an incredibly interesting thing how sort of like nature makes these things pop out and happen, because if they don't, things will be unbalanced. And I know that's kind of far afield from the point you were making there, but still,
it's kind of like Jung's idea of the inferior part of your personality, whatever that is, whatever part of you it might be, whatever that characteristic is. If it doesn't get expressed, it gets a pretty drastic change or move is made, and so, it's
Blue Planet season 2. It's good.
I wanted to, can I bring up something else? So when Maggie pulls up to the bar, there's a song playing in the background, and the lyrics are, "She was there 1 minute and then she was gone." So I just thought it was kind of,
man, that's deep. You catch those things. It's pretty cool.
It's because that's what, the pivotal, it's almost like previously on an episode of True Detective. She was there and she was gone, tucked in.
They did a lion copulation, and then she left.
Yeah.
And nobody was happy about it. Yeah, that's interesting. I did not notice that. Obviously, I didn't notice it. I was watching what was happening. I tend not to focus on what music is playing, I guess, especially lyrics. I'm not very lyrically attuned. I tend to gloss over lyrics, even if there are lyrics playing, and listen to the music itself. Man, don't listen to that much music, but
that's why you have me on this thing, on this podcast, so I can be there. I can superiorly function as the inferior function.
If we were plugged into each other, then that would be my new trick.
Yeah.